Hi guys, it's Kelly Latibola here, and I am back with another video for W+9. Today I am going to be using the modern peonies and the modern anemones, and doing just kind of like a little bit of a watercolor background. So these are the two sets that I'm using. The sentiment, the flowers, the leaves, the whole shebang is from both of these sets. So I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper and intense black ink from Simon Says Stamp. After I watercolor, I'm going to do some Copic coloring, and this is Copic safe. So I'm going to start by stamping up my flowers. This was actually inspired by a wedding cake that I saw on Pinterest, and the flowers were at the between the two layers, but it had kind of like an iCat pattern that went up from the flowers and then down onto the next layer, and I thought that it looked just uber cool, and I thought I could recreate it with watercolor. So I'm stamping and masking. This is the largest peony, and then the medium size, and then same thing with the anemones. I used the two bigger ones that are in the set. And I also, what funny story, you're not going to get to see it because it ends up being taped over, but I was being cheapskate and I didn't want to cut two masks because I'm cheap and I'm lazy. So I only cut one mask for the flower that I stamped twice. And at some point I moved the mask to the other flower and I did not even realize it. And then when I went to add in an additional leaf, like you'll hear, this is me moving the mask over. And then I wanted to stamp an additional leaf on the right hand side, and there was no mask there, guys. Nah, I just stamped right over it. So thankfully this is a 6x6 piece of watercolor paper, and I knew I was going to be trimming it down. So I'm working on my Ranger Craft mat with some distress inks. And this card is actually for my sister's birthday, and her bag is pinks and oranges and yellows, so that's how I ended up with this color scheme. I'm using two different brushes. One is from the Silver Brush Company, which is a inch wide paintbrush, and then the other one is a 3/4 one from the Ranger. One of these is more expensive than the other. Both of them work fine. Just use whatever you got in your arsenal. I'm putting down some clean, clear water. I want just a sheen of water on my paper. I don't want it to be sopping wet. And I'm starting in the middle. I'm not putting any water above the center of the flowers. And then I have my paper taped down to a board, and I'm going to tilt it so that as I'm applying the color, it starts to run. Now, I didn't want the drips to go all the way down to the bottom of the card, so I have my paper towel handy so I can blot up anything that's not going the way I want it to. If you have an area that is not running the way that you want it to, just pick up some more pigment or some more water and add it just to that area. It will help it to move. But I'm not really manipulating the color as far as the bottom edges, not yet anyway. So I wanted the pink to be a little bit darker, so I'm just kind of adding more of that in. And then while it's still wet, I am going to move on to the next color. Wait, I think I'm going to add some more pink. I lied. This is where I'm making it darker. I just really like that picked raspberry when it's bright. But sometimes it can be a little difficult to get it super bright. So deepening up that pigment, I'm not manipulating any of the edges like I said, and now I'm going to move on to the carved pumpkin. The pink is still wet. I want it to be still wet because I want them to make friends and I want them to move together. So when I tilt the board up, it will run to where the pink has already ran. So it kind of gives a, I guess like a built up look. The orange the carved pumpkin is a very strong color, which I love bright colors. So this does not bother me. But I wanted to make sure that everything was kind of going to be in the same shade. And then the last one I'm going to go in with is the mustard seed. Now you would think to yourself, like, you're going to put yellow over pink and orange. That's never going to show up. But because it's watercolor, it totally will. The next color kind of pushes that water out of the way, and then you can see all of them, which is awesome. Here, two of my drippy areas were connecting, and I did not want that. So I just blotted it up, and then I'm going to go back in with clean water And I'm being careful not to touch the edges of the darker color that I already have there, and just blotted it up, and it came up, it was fine. So I'm kind of moving it around up and down till I'm happy with the way that things are moving. If you have some darker areas that you don't love, just blot it up with a paper towel. I'm going to go back in and just kind of play with the color at this point to get the look that I'm going for. So I'm intensifying some of the colors. I felt like my pink got a little bit lost, so I'm going to scoop up some of that pink and then put that back down in. And here is where I'm going to play with the edges. So if I had someplace where I wanted it no drips occurred, but I wanted there to be, now this is the place where I can go ahead and add those in so that it's a nice, all the colors are represented in the watercolor border. Because I have some pooling, I'm going to have what they call blooms. That means when I dry it down, which this is it dried, there's going to be hard edges in there. It was fine for me. It didn't bother me. So I'm going to flip the paper over and I'm going to do the same thing all over again. This did create a line in the middle of my project. I knew I was going to be Copic coloring over the flowers, so this was like no harm, no foul for me. It didn't bother me any. But if it bothers you, I would maybe kind of play with that color a little bit, go back in with some clean clear water and kind of see if you could buff it out or add some color on top of it. I did want to make it just a little bit more interesting, so I'm splattering on just some clean clear water. And I did do this a few times in order to get those lines kind of broken up and a little bit more organic looking. The last thing I'm going to do is use the W+9 Pure Shimmer spray. This just gives a nice, it's kind of like a pinkish iridescent shimmer, and I totally love it. So I sprinkled that on, and then I'm going to dry it down so everything's completely dry. I cut it down to the size of a card front, and you can see that shimmer from the spray, and then I'm going to start into the Copic coloring. Now, I've done Copics over watercolor before. I'm sure you've seen it, but typically I start with my lightest color because I'm very heavy-handed with my darks. So you guys never really get to see a different style of coloring. So today, A, to push myself, B, to show you guys that there is another way to do it, I decided to start with my darkest color on this peony. So I'm starting with an RV69. It's a super dark color, very dark. And what I'm doing is just using the tip of the marker. I'm applying no pressure. It's none. I'm just kind of dragging the very, very tip of the marker in the darkest areas. And because of the way peonies are made, the way God made them, they are a multi-petal flower. So there's a lot of kind of intricacies involved here, and it can be a little bit overwhelming to color. This part did take me a while. I'm not even going to show you the whole thing. That's how long it took. But the good part about this approach is once you have that original kind of blueprint down where you've laid all of your shadows in, the rest of it's cake because you've done all the hard work just in putting down those little lines and giving yourself that map to follow. So then you just know that you have to blend out wherever that dark color is, and then the rest of it goes really, really fast. This is not a 2-layer approach. So when I normally color, I start from my lightest, go out to my darkest, from my darkest back to my lightest. This is just a one-time deal, and everything blends pretty well together. A lot of the little areas, because there isn't a lot of real estate on some of these petals, I'm just doing a line and then bringing out the color as I introduce more colors into it. Some of the petals are a little bit larger, so I didn't have to do that. I could kind of start my feathering almost right away with the colors. And then for the lightest color, I'm just going to go in for the highlighted. So the parts that are kind of folded over and the very edges of the petals. I'm not going over the entire flower. The reason I'm not going over the entire flower is because an RV02 really bleaches out an RV04, and I didn't want to ruin any of the shading I just did. For the center, I kept it super simple. I picked a couple of brighter yellows. and just use the lightest one to fill in the whole center, and then the kind of medium tone, I just did some dots in the center and then where those petals kind of folded over it. For the smaller peony, I'm going to go back to the way I originally color. So that way, if this is the first time that you've ever seen my particular style, both of them are represented. If you're looking for a comparison, this is going to be a good video for you to watch this portion of it. So the reason that I start with my lightest color is because A, heavy-handed with my darks, or at least I was when I first started. I actually was pretty okay with the way that other peony turned out. But when I first started and I was first learning, I was putting a lot of pressure down. I was eating up that highlight. I wasn't getting any dimension. So in order to kind of force myself to have some self-control, I started with my lightest colors. The second reason I start with my lightest colors is because if you make a mistake, if you make an error, if you put a shadow where there should be a highlight, you can literally cover it up no problem because you use your lightest color. So it's kind of like a fail-safe for myself when I'm coloring. It does take a little bit longer, the whole of it, because you're going over everything twice. But I also feel like I get a better blend. That's just me. Some people get a great blend. It also depends on the colors you're using too. But the idea is the same as the larger peony. I'm putting in those shadows using just a line on the tinier petals. And because I'm going over this twice, I'm doing just a line on all of the petals the first time around. I'm not doing any flicking. I'm not doing any blending or anything like that. I'm just giving myself that roadmap to kind of follow. Like I said before, peonies are created with these multiple petals, and they're very full flowers, and they're just stunning. But because of that, this is not a good type of flower to color if you're going to practice your flicking. I'm going to go back over this out to my lightest color. You may be asking yourself, Kelly, why are you going over this with yellow when it's clear you're not even going to be able to see it? The background is orange, you're going over it with yellow. The reason I am is because those colors, even though they're not going to be opaque, they're not going to cover up the stuff in the background, they will add some brightness to the flower and to the highlights. For the two anemones, I'm only going to show you the color combination I used. I'm not going to show you the coloring part of it. It wasn't anything fancy, just adding the darkest colors to the base. I wanted to show you that you could color the leaves. I had intended on it. But then I just really kind of liked the way that it looked with those leaves having really nothing on them and letting the flowers be the show and just kind of like bleed out into that background. But I wanted to show you that you could. I used blue greens and yellow greens. They both looked fine even though I was putting them over pinks. I used my white gel pen to kind of highlight the stamen that are on the flowers. And then I re-outline all of my images. The reason I do this is because I like a bold outline, also because I'm stamping on watercolor paper, so maybe the stamping isn't going to be great. But you'll see I'm using two different pens here. The reason is because I didn't want the leaves to have a thicker outline because I wanted the flowers to be the star of the show. So I used a 0.25 on the leaves and a 0.35 on the flowers. I felt like the leaves needed to be pushed back just a little bit into the background, so I'm using a C1 to just add a little bit of gray so that the other flowers pop a little bit more. For my sentiment, I am going to be white heat embossing, so I'm using my embossing bag to just get any extra static off of my work surface and make sure I get a good impression. I'm going to stamp the sentiment in Versamark ink, which is a clear sticky ink, and then I'm going to put Simon Says Stamp white embossing powder right over top of that. The whole time I'm doing all of these other steps, I have my heat tool on and preparing, so that way it's good and hot and it eliminates a lot of the warping that you get with heat embossing. I went ahead and stamped the rest of the sentiment and heat embossed that. It didn't stand out quite as much as I would have liked, so I'm just going to add in a little drop shadow with that 0.25 marker to the bottom left of the sentiment, and this just helps it kind of pop off the page. The last thing I did was add some clear sequins. I will spare you that torture because it took me forever to figure out where I wanted them to go. And then that is the whole card. So thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope whichever way you color, you get something in this week to be creative with, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Bye.